Welcome, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this GMF virtual event in partnership with the Canadian Embassy in Paris. I am Martin Quincé, I'm the Deputy Director and Research Fellow at the Paris office of the German Marshall Fund. I'm very happy to host and chair this conversation today on After AUKUS, which perspectives for transatlantic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's not an overstatement to say that the public announcement of AUKUS a bit more than a month ago now was one of the most consequential foreign policy moments of the year. And we now pretty much live in a post-AUKUS world here in Europe, as well as the Indo-Pacific. The technical details of the partnership of this new security and defense partnership are still to be clearly defined. But what we understand already is that this security partnership will allow the US, Australia, and the UK to significantly deepen cooperation around a range of defense capabilities, and among them a new nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. The joint statement of the three countries after the public announcement of the partnership underlines that AUKUS will help sustain peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. And that is one of the questions we'll ask today during our conversation. But what we will look at more specifically with our three speakers are the reactions to AUKUS, the way it is understood in different parts of the world among allies of the US, the UK, and Australia, the way some allies may want to adapt their own Indo-Pacific strategy or approach to the region following this new framework of cooperation, and perhaps what it means more broadly for transatlantic relations. And I'm really happy to have a very complementary panel today to address all these issues with Dr. Alexandra de Hoop-Scheffer, Director of Research for Transatlantic Security and Director of the Paris office of the German Marshall Fund. We'll look at the implications for the transatlantic relationship as a whole, understand the context of this relationship following the AUKUS announcement, and perhaps also see more precisely what it means for cooperation between the US and Europeans on a whole range of issues. With Dr. Mathieu Duchâtel, head of the Asia program at the Institut Montaigne in Paris, we will look more specifically at the way France reacted to AUKUS and how Paris may want to rethink or redefine some of its own policies and strategies in the Indo-Pacific. And last but not least, with Dr. Jonathan Berkshire-Miller, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the Ottawa-based MacDonald Laurier Institute. We will discuss the Canadian reaction and interpretation of what has happened as one of the Five Eyes group, which is not part of AUKUS. I think it is particularly interesting to look at the Canadian perspective on this event. So this discussion is on the record. You may have noticed it is actually recorded and will be posted on the GMF YouTube channel. I want to thank again our partners at the Canadian Embassy in Paris for their support and for helping us putting this event together. We will give each panelist approximately 8-9 minutes to share their views, give us some kickoff remarks before we take questions from the floor. And to all the participants, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I guess everybody knows now how to use Zoom. We'll take questions in the second part of the conversation. But without further ado, I want to give the floor first to Alexandra to discuss the transatlantic context post-AUKUS.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon or this morning if you're joining us from the other side of the Atlantic. And very happy to see that there are many of you participating in this event, and probably because it raises a lot of questions. And very happy to be able to discuss that with my two colleagues, panelists. Very briefly, for me, the AUKUS alliance revealed three things. One, it confirmed the United States geopolitical priority, China. And there is a sequence, at least this is really how we analyze it here from Paris and from Europe more broadly. There is a sequence between the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the announcement of this AUKUS alliance. President Biden is operationalizing the so-called pivot to Asia. He goes further than his predecessors, President Obama, further than President Trump. And so from my perspective, the AUKUS deal was primarily about China. Which is something that we understand, obviously, but the way it was done shows that Europe was, at the end of the day, an afterthought, a collateral damage. And obviously, the foremost consideration for the United States here was the element of strategic surprise vis-a-vis China. So the Biden administration effort to shift US focus from the post 9/11, decade-long wars in the Middle East to now concentrating on this so-called competition with China does make a lot of sense. It does make a lot of strategic sense, but that shift has not been easy on Europeans, right? On European ally. It has created, fueled, enhanced a sort of mutual distrust among transatlantic allies, but also divisions, pre-existing divisions among Europeans. For me, and this is something that I've been writing with my colleague Martin Conseil, who introduced this conversation, AUKUS results in part from a mutual distrust between the United States and their European allies. From the Washington perspective, the EU, European partners are too soft on China, and from a European perspective, the United States is acting too aggressively on China. It was very revealing to read the French Minister for Finance, Bruno Le Maire, interviewed in the New York Times just a few days ago, summarizing that way. The United States wants to confront China, the European Union wants to engage China. So there is, I think, a common assessment between Europeans and Americans about what the China challenge is about and potentially will be about. But there is a different way of addressing it, right? And there seems to be a lot of expectations on the American side. The United States is seeking strategic clarity at a time where Europeans are outlining strategic ambiguity or strategic flexibility by approaching China through the triptych cooperation, competition, and confrontation. But that, to a certain extent, leads me to say that we are not that disaligned with the American approach. And in fact, I'm quite also, surprised to see how the debates we've been having here in Europe vis-a-vis our approach regarding China has very much also influenced the way the American administration is also approaching China under this threefold flexible approach, where we obviously need to compete, to cooperate, partner, and sometimes be slightly more confrontational. And I would say probably where we disagree the most transatlantically is on the third C, i.e. confrontation. We don't have the same sense of, I would say, urgency or speed. I'm very struck in conversations, I had these last months with American colleagues, how, short-term the China threat is from an American perspective, and how from a European perspective, it is something that we're looking in a more longer term approach. And that also leads to the sort of discrepancy I've been talking about. So this leads to, at the end of the day, very little space for autonomy. What is very clear is that the United States is seeking to preserve its primacy in the Indo-Pacific. The marginalization of France in this AUKUS episode outlines an exclusively American strategy for the Indo-Pacific, a region that is understood as a space for containing Chinese influence and power. And the fact that France was not associated with the evolution of Australia's assessment or reassessment of its strategic needs, despite the fact that its partnership was being strengthened, speaks volumes about Australia's American alignment. And the fact that at the end of the day, France, European partners cannot compete with the power or the strength of US security guarantees. And I think that's also something that we need to learn as an implication of this AUKUS alliance. The second thing I take from the AUKUS alliance is that it clearly signaled to Europe that it is not perceived as a global player with whom the United States will gain from deepening its cooperation, at least in the Indo-Pacific, which to me was a bit contradictory when you put that in the context of a Biden administration calling for greater European awareness vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific, and as such, a growing engagement in the region. And so this really questions the European allies' importance for the United States regarding competition with China, but also with Russia. And so I really believe that, this EU-US dialogue on both China and Russia are constructive first steps at the condition that we really focus on, I would say, concrete issues when addressing China and Russia in a EU-US framework. And it happens, at a time where, as you all know, the EU has been stepping up, including in the Indo-Pacific, has been developing its own strategy for the Indo-Pacific in a much more balanced way, probably in comparison to the American approach. I know in several conversations I had with American colleagues that, the concept that we use here in France of puissance d'équilibre, which is basically balancing power, has been probably interpreted on the other side of the Atlantic as unreliability in the competition with China. But I would rather invite our American friends and colleagues to see this sort of more balanced approach as a strategic advantage and not as strategic uncertainty or unreliability. Because in fact, it allows Asian powers to also diversify their partnerships, their cooperations, their relationship outside of this binary US-China competition. And in fact, it's really interesting to see how France has increasingly been working with Japan, strengthening its military cooperation, strengthening also its military exercises organized by the Quad countries. So I do believe in these interconnections between the transatlantic and trans-Pacific alliances. They will certainly become an increasing part of both the European and the United States Indo-Pacific strategy. So there is a certain amount of overlapping, which should be leading us to to a more efficient cooperation than it is today. The other thing I take from the AUKUS alliance is that the debate here in Europe has also been, well, what does it mean to be an ally of the United States, especially in the Indo-Pacific region? What does it mean in terms of the preferred formats of cooperation when dealing with China? And what's interesting to see is that there again we diverge. For France in particular, the focus is very much EU and how to strengthen the EU-US cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, whereas for the United States, the focus is obviously very NATO, right? With the idea of, as we are looking to the next NATO summit in Madrid, of also, reinforcing the connections between NATO and the Quad countries, for example, something that France has been showing more resistance to. What does it mean in terms of the transatlantic relationship and cooperation? And I'll just end up here. I would say first, China is accelerating what I would call the geopoliticization of the EU. The president of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, you all remember, arrived at the head of the Commission saying we need to make the EU more geopolitical. Well, I truly believe that China and the COVID-19 crisis have really accelerated that geopoliticalization because it truly revealed our hyper-dependencies vis-a-vis China, including on very simple things like producing masks or pharmaceutical products. So there is really an awareness, as President Macron said, that we are entering an era where we are ending a certain European naivete vis-a-vis China. And I think that the EU strategy towards the Indo-Pac very much relates to a lot of what the American approach to China is about, focusing on building resilient value chains, setting in standards setting in trade, digital domains, emerging technologies, in line with democratic principles. So there is a lot of common ground, and probably, and I hope so, that this crisis that the AUKUS alliance created will be the beginning of very concrete operational conversation on how we can better cooperate, integrate our strategies. But for that, obviously, we need to rebuild trust. Because an alliance is based on trust first and foremost. It is based also on predictability. And the way this AUKUS alliance was handled kind of put in the air these two basic principles of what it is to be allies. And I'll just end there, maybe for a question we can raise in the Q&A part. I think we also need to decide as Americans and Europeans about how we want to work together as partners. Do we want to continue to be frustrated around the so-called boring burden sharing debate? Or do we want to be more ambitious and move towards a risk sharing approach, which means that we will not be dividing tasks where the US, and this is a US temptation, saying, okay, we are okay for European strategic autonomy in your neighborhoods, deal with the mess, in your southern neighborhood, increase deterrence vis-a-vis the eastern flank, and we will take care of the big threat, which is China. I don't think that's satisfying either for Europeans, either for the United States, because again, we have so much overlapping interest in the Indo-Pacific. France, along with other European partners, including Germany, including the Netherlands, and the EU institutions have been stepping up their approach in the Indo-Pacific. So to me, this should be really seized as a moment to not compete with one another, or exclude important allies in that configuration, but should really be the beginning of discussing concretely how we can work efficiently in the Indo-Pacific region. I'll just end here.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and a great way to start the conversation. I want to now move to Mathieu, and Alexandra already mentioned the fact that France was very much the sort of collateral damage of AUKUS somehow, with the so-called deal of the century being put aside for this new partnership to emerge. Could you please make us understand really the French reaction to what has happened, and perhaps also the French interpretation of what it means for its future approach to the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for having me today. I have attended several discussions in transatlantic formats, in intra-European formats regarding AUKUS and what it means for France. And what I have found really striking in those discussions was the fact that there's one point that is often lost in the discussion. And I would say in particular in the discussion as it is conducted in the United States, but it's true also of some European capitals. I think that for the French interests in the Indo-Pacific, this is not only a matter of losing a submarine contract that clearly was engaging for the French company in question, but not vital, by the way. Of course, the secrecy in which the discussions were conducted and concluded hurt to some extent, but this, you can argue that this will be digested over time. No, what I think is missing from the discussion is the realization that France has national security interests in the Indo-Pacific space. And without going too much into the details, I think it's important to remind everyone that in the French exclusive economic zone in the Pacific Ocean, there is a disputed area. There is a dispute with Vanuatu that relates to the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone of New Caledonia. And there is also the question of the future of New Caledonia, which will undergo its third referendum for independence later this year in December. To make a very long story short, I think you can argue, and that has been part of the perception here in Paris, that whatever weakens French interest in the Indo-Pacific has a negative impact, or potentially a negative impact, on French national security interest in the region. And I think that the French support for a maritime order strictly based on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is really not a posture to support arms sales in the region, as you sometimes hear from cynical observers. I think that France has a national security and sovereignty stake in ensuring that the maritime order that governs exclusive economic zone, but also the rules regarding passage of naval ships in various maritime territories is strictly governed on UNCLOS. And this has been the policy of France to employ the naval capacities of the French military to that aim. And I would point out that this was the meaning of building a long-term partnership with Australia, patiently and incrementally over time, by being there and looking at the future together. That's my first point regarding French national security interest in the Indo-Pacific. My second point is what this whole AUKUS episode tells us about the extent to which the US values a helpful European contribution to the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. And on this point, you hear very different views. Coming from India, for example, you hear the view that a meaningful European contribution to the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific space is very much welcome, whatever it is, that you need diversification, that you need different poles, that you need different contributions and diversity. From the circles close to the Biden administration, I'm not exactly sure what the view is. you hear the right things, for example, that the more participation, the better for American interest in the region. But I think that in practice, the China strategy of the Biden administration has been split this year in two different pillars when it comes to cooperation with Europe. And they have not so far been coordinated well, it seems to me, despite all the emphasis on building coalitions. You have the trade and tech pillar, for which Europe is clearly a key partner seen from Washington. And this is true of a variety of issues such as export controls, investment screening, aligning our practices on those issues related to technology transfers to China. You have an ambitious transatlantic agenda regarding building norms and standards for emerging technologies. You even have an emerging agenda regarding addressing together the shortages in semiconductor supply chains. This is an agenda that is really moving and that is related to responding to Chinese international behavior. And this has been only marginally affected by the management of relations with France, because there are common interests and there is a sustained engagement on the part of the Biden administration. And also because, to be frank, this was a European initiative last November to push forward this Trade and Technology Council idea as a priority item for transatlantic cooperation. The question here, I think, is how far we go in a transatlantic format. The second pillar is the Indo-Pacific, and precisely the question of the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. And I do not think that the European contribution is valued, and I would agree with Alexandra in that regard. You could point out that this may be changing going forward as a result of the AUKUS crisis, but I think that fundamentally the strategy of the US will remain to rely first and foremost on the US-Japan alliance, and then on the Quad, and then perhaps as another circle on AUKUS, especially if the SSN project can become a success story, which in itself is something to be questioned, given the history of the submarine programs in Australia. And here I just want to add the fact that given the nature of French security interests in the Indo-Pacific space, you can make the argument that an Australian capacity to operate nuclear submarines within the first island chain can be seen as a positive contribution to the military balance and to the risk of conflict that could come from unilateral Chinese action inside the first island chain, be it regarding the Taiwan issue or maritime disputes in the South China Sea. The question is when, of course, when the Australian Navy will have that capacity to act. And this is, in fact, another discussion, but a very interesting one as well. But compared to this future capacity of the Australian Navy to operate within the first island chain, I think it's often the French naval approach to that space doesn't get that much attention or doesn't lead to strategic conclusions being taken in Washington regarding how to work with the French regarding that space. You know that a nuclear submarine was operated by the French Navy inside the first island chain earlier this year for the first time. At least this was the first time this was communicated publicly. You've probably heard that a signal intelligence ship of the French Navy sailed through the Taiwan Strait earlier this year, demonstrating again freedom of navigation under UNCLOS. These are very concrete actions, but these are actions that are being conducted to support French national security interests, and in particular freedom of navigation, but conducted autonomously without coordination with the United States. And I would rephrase and in fact phrase differently the questions asked by Alexandra. It seems to me that the real question for the US going forward is whether it will welcome and value autonomous French engagement in the Indo-Pacific, or is it going to put all its resources on requesting strict alignment on US-led actions in the military space, in the military sector. Let me conclude with two thoughts. French interest in the Indo-Pacific will certainly not disappear overnight. France is working to enroll and in fact to convince other European countries beyond the adoption of the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, which needs to be implemented. But you have to remember that many countries in Europe are skeptical. You also have to realize that undermining French interest in the Indo-Pacific is not going to help France to convince its European partners of the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific for the EU. I would tend to think that the French approach is more in line with the American vision of the Indo-Pacific than it is of the German and Dutch approaches. And I don't want to overemphasize differences, but it seems to me that there is one key difference in the fact that the French approach is very much focused on key bilateral relations. There was Australia, there is India, there is Japan, whereas the Dutch and the German approaches emphasize very much trade and investment and ASEAN centrality, multilateral approaches, etc. This is very different for that matters, and I think that what is going to happen going forward is obviously renewed efforts on the French side to deepen partnerships with India and Japan. I think that this bilateral approach centered on key partners in the Indo-Pacific space is not going to disappear at all. I think that on the contrary, and some positive developments may occur with other countries. I'm thinking in particular of Indonesia. We start hearing more about French relations with Indonesia. And of course, there is one question for the French arms industry and diplomacy towards the region, which is the question of nuclear propulsion in future submarine contracts, which has in fact been opened by the decision of the United States. And finally, one final point, really to open the discussion, because I will raise this as a question and in fact as a critic of the way France is reacting to this AUKUS episode. You get a lot of questions regarding what France is really asking the United States when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. There have been 4 elements emphasized by the French side in discussions with the Biden administration in the aftermath of AUKUS. One has been strategic autonomy, requesting some sort of a political endorsement from the United States. The other one is European defense. There is a very concrete agenda on Sahel and counterterrorism, but there's also Indo-Pacific in the mix. We keep on asking the French Foreign Ministry, what exactly are you asking the United States when it comes to Indo-Pacific cooperation? So far, I don't think that they want to communicate much about it, but it is clearly an important area of focus going forward. And I think that as observers, we will hopefully learn more in the coming weeks and months regarding that particular aspect of US-France relations.
Thank you, Mathieu. Let us now turn to Jonathan and turn to the perspective from Canada, both an Atlantic and a Pacific power, to understand how the announcement of AUKUS was perceived in Ottawa and what it means for Canadian strategy there.
Well, thank you very much, Martin and Alexandra, for hosting this really important discussion. Good morning to friends here in Canada and in North America. Good afternoon to those in Europe, and good night, perhaps, to those soldiers who have stayed up with us in the Asia-Pacific region. So much has been said already, and I don't want to repeat some of the excellent points from my panelists, but let me start with the 2 important perspectives that Canada has taken from AUKUS, and then sort of tease out the implications a little bit on what this means for Canada as we look at the Indo-Pacific region. So first of all, let's look at the tactical reaction. So the tactical Canadian reaction to AUKUS, and as I mentioned to some of my fellow panelists in a previous discussion, This was a very challenging timing for Canada because we had an election, I think it was about 5 days or a week before, following the AUKUS announcement. So it was kind of challenging to have the time to put in a real thoughtful reaction to this development. That being said, the tactical reaction was pretty much like this. With regard to the Five Eyes Alliance that Canada is a member of, we don't feel that AUKUS necessarily threatens our position in the Five Eyes. We see AUKUS very much as a technical agreement between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, whether it's on nuclear submarines and also on defense technology issues. But the official line is that we don't see this as a threat or challenge to our position in the Five Eyes Alliance, which we see very much as an intelligence sharing agreement with our partners. The reality is, though, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, I think that it is true that the Five Eyes will continue. We have our own mandate, we have our own history. But the reality is that Canada, along with many other partners of the United States, was caught off guard by the AUKUS announcement. And I think we very closely have to look at how the Five Eyes evolves, in particular on China issues, and whether whether it becomes a Three Eye. I think the Five Eyes will continue in some sort of context, but I think definitely this is a bit of a wake-up call for Canada that there are internal groupings happening within the Five Eyes. Some of this has been happening even before the AUKUS announcement, and I think that makes us rethink in many ways how we've been approaching China and also how we've been thinking about the Indo-Pacific region more broadly. The sort of second tactical takeaway, and I think this is something that the Canadian government has tried not to be as upfront on, but I think both panelists have mentioned this, and I think the Canadian side would agree that there are a lot of positives, I think, of AUKUS in terms of regional security and deterrence. Of course, there are negatives in the way that this came out, and I think we're also very concerned about cleavages in the transatlantic relationship. And I think many of the issues that Alexandra brought up about trust between alliances and partners, and I think we'll see this play out not only in the bilateral context, but also in the NATO context going forward. But that being said, I think there are a lot of positives. I think this leads me in a way to my second point on the strategic takeaway. And looking at the positives, I think one of the things that the Canadian side needs to look at is while we have a different geographic threat concept and perspective than Australia, we share a lot with Australia as well. We're also a middle power, a US ally, and we also have been challenged with a very combative relationship with China in recent years. So to see, especially in the Australian context, if you think back 15 years ago when the Quad 1.0 was struggling to get off its feet, Australia was talking about the Asian century, and very much Australia's alternative future was looking very different. And I think that's very instructive in many ways for Canada as it looks to this region, because Australia's threat perception has fundamentally changed. And I think that this is very important as we look towards the Indo-Pacific region, is that the perception that this is just the Americans essentially taking its allies along for the road is not quite accurate. The reality is that many states in this region, Australia being one of them, have deep concerns about the security developments and concerns in their region and are making decisions, some of them very realpolitik, that would help pursue their interests. So I think this is one of the strategic takeaways that Canada is going to have to take from this. The final sort of point on, and this is the most important, is what does this mean for Canada? And I think that for Canada, the main takeaway is that we absolutely need to imminently think about a robust strategy for the Indo-Pacific. And I know many of my colleagues back in Ottawa and overseas are deeply thinking about this. And I'm very happy that the Canadian Embassy in Paris has partnered with GMF to host an event such as this. So there is work happening right now on realizing the Indo-Pacific. Frankly, I think the Canadian side has been a bit behind the eight ball on this. We know even from the European context, we have the French obviously have their own Indo-Pacific strategy out. The Germans have their outlines. The Netherlands have their approach. The UK has articulated something to this effect with their integrated defense review. Even ASEAN as an organization that very much has to balance and hedge in its relationships between the US and China also has an outlook for the Indo-Pacific. So I think the imminency for us to very deeply think about the Indo-Pacific is there right now. But the second point, and I think AUKUS sort of sheds light on this for the Canadian side, is that we need to understand that the Indo-Pacific, and thinking about the free and open Indo-Pacific, is not the US strategy for the Indo-Pacific. So I think there's a perception, and often this was a perception, I think, especially under the previous administration in Washington, that effectively, if we were to pursue an Indo-Pacific approach, that this would be adopting a hard US line on China. And effectively, we would be losing this place in between, a sort of a neutral position that Canada might have. My answer to that always has been, number one, we are not a neutral state. We have one border, and while it's not always a perfect relationship with the United States, we are a strategic partner and ally, number one trading partner. And so no matter which way we think about the Indo-Pacific, our relationship with the United States will be deeply interwoven in that. The caveat to that point is that we need not also mimic the United States Indo-Pacific approach. So there's room for us to look to others when we think about how we want to think about this region. And I think very much I'm happy to have this discussion with French colleagues and European colleagues, because I think those approaches and strategies in Europe, I think will be very, very important for Canada as we finalize our approach. We need to frankly take the best of the current strategies out there, some of the different realities, some of the different geographies that states that have already articulated Indo-Pacific approaches, and make a made in Canada approach to this region. Some of it will incorporate some of the common pillars that the United States and Japan and others have, but I think we'll also take parts from European states and also ASEAN. So I think that is one thing for Canada as we develop an Indo-Pacific approach. The last point I'll make is that we need to get very creative and creative very quickly. The geostrategic stakes and landscape in this region are moving at a blistering pace. And the idea of maybe 10, 15 years ago, and I don't want to say this was the case for, for every government in Canada, but, across partisan lines, I think there was a sense that the Asia Pacific and now the framing of the Indo-Pacific was basically a luxury item. So you would, when we all used to travel, you would go to the duty-free store and you would pick something up at the duty-free shop as a luxury item. We sort of viewed the Indo-Pacific, and especially in security terms, as a luxury item. Effectively, this was not Canada's fight. We would support through multilateral fora, and obviously we were a US ally, but basically this was the Americans' problem. I think we're realizing now, whether it's in our most recent downfall in our relationship with China and the sort of proliferation of security concerns in this region, that this is not a luxury item. This is not an isolated thing that Canada can just step away from, engage economically and in trade terms with the Indo-Pacific, but effectively ignore or downplay the security issues. So I think that is one element. The second, and sort of I'll end on this point because I think this is important in our relations with countries like France, is we need to get creative in what I call the vehicles of engagement in the region. Canada, I think, similar to France and other friends in Europe, very much is attached to the multilateral architecture, be it NATO, be it some of the organizations in Asia. We're a founding dialogue partner of the ASEAN Regional Forum, Asian Development Bank, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, et cetera. All of those will continue to play an important function, and I'm a proponent of ASEAN centrality in many respects. That being said, I think that they are necessary but insufficient to address the challenges in this region going forward. So I think we need to get a lot more creative, and this is not to say AUKUS is the solution, but I think AUKUS is one part of a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle in the Indo-Pacific, in addition to the Quad, in addition to the other overlapping trilaterals and minilaterals, in addition to the multilaterals and bilateral relationships. So rather than thinking that we can go to a couple multilateral fora in the Indo-Pacific and secure our interests, I think we need to get a lot more creative. Part of that will be hinged on our relationship with the Americans. So, I'm not suggesting that we don't do things with the United States. In fact, some of our minilateral engagements so far have been with the United States. We have, for example, a keen sword naval exercises that we've done with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces and the US Navy, and that's proven very successful. But we can also do minilateral cooperation outside of the US rubric as well. And we've seen some key US allies do this. For example, the Japanese and the Indians, in addition to having relationships with the United States through the Quad, they also have a trilateral grouping that is Japan, India, and Australia. So there's ways that we can sort of, whether it's formal minilateral groupings or whether it's ad hoc, that we can work minilaterally in this region. And I would close by saying I would hope that France would be a natural partner with Canada in this. And there are many different formulations and areas that we could think about, whether it's humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, whether it's on climate security issues. But I think that there are opportunities there. And I think one of the natural hinge points for this minilateral cooperation, frankly, would be Japan. I think the idea of a Canada, France, Japan, maybe maybe this is done somewhere in ASEAN, maybe this is done in South Asia or in the Pacific, especially considering France's interests and experience there would be very valuable. So I will leave it there for now, but very excited to have questions and discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan. And yes, we have quite a few questions already in the Q&A. I have questions myself, but I'll try maybe to sort of bundle together a couple of questions that we see from the audience. And maybe let's do it in reverse. One of the questions maybe for you, Jonathan, would be your assessment of the US ability to even honor its commitment to Australia as part of AUKUS. What is it at this point, knowing that obviously the partnership still leaves a lot to imagination at this point? What is it in the partnership that you see as credible or less credible, and in the US commitment to Australia? Another question, also something that could be also for both Jonathan and Mathieu, is what exactly is the role of the UK, both in AUKUS and in the Indo-Pacific in general? Mathieu, you mentioned the fact that the US was not that interested perhaps in cooperation with Europe in the Indo-Pacific as much as it is in cooperation with Europe on the trade and tech pillar that you mentioned. Now, the UK, not an EU member, obviously, but still a European power, is part of the partnership. What do you make of this, and what to expect of their role? A question for both Mathieu and Alexandra, and there are a few questions on the European strategic autonomy debate. How France perhaps will translate its reaction to AUKUS into a rethinking or redefinition of its ambition in terms of European strategic autonomy. Clearly, the reactions from European capitals were at best limited, and there might be some takeaways in Paris on that side. On the other hand, another participant mentioned the fact that perhaps the European reaction should not be confused with the French one. And it is quite clear that what French sees as a transatlantic crisis or is perceived as a purely Franco-American, British, and Australian crisis in many parts of Europe. And the last question, more specifically to Alexandra, is what to expect from the French-US discussions post-AUKUS and this sort of commitment from the White House to engage in a constructive dialogue with Paris on a series of issues. Three main issues from the communique after the call between Biden and Macron: question of European strategic autonomy, US support to Sahel, and US-French cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So let's do it in reverse. We have 10-15 minutes. Maybe Jonathan first.
Well, thanks, Martin. Some excellent questions there. Let me start with your point on AUKUS from a US perspective, and then I'll kind of dovetail into the UK. And one of the things that I think that I'll make a final point on, which I think is important and we haven't really talked about, is the opportunity that this presents, I think, for China, if they take it, which I'm not sure that they will take it, but we can kind of dive into that a little bit as well. First, with regard to the US and their sort of role in AUKUS and where I see things going, essentially, I see this as, if you think in poker terms, I mean, this is a massive bet. So I think both sides are sort of going all in on each other. So the positive side of this, so the glass half full side, is that from an alliance credibility perspective, a deterrence perspective, the United States is showing Australia through this commitment, this unprecedented commitment, I should say, that we have your back, that we are willing to go to unprecedented lengths. And not only, well, technically this may be allowed through the non-proliferation treaty, but also some of the collateral damage, as you said, to its longest standing alliance with France and reputation in the transatlantic community. So all of these factors, the US has been willing to take that hit to say that we feel like it's valuable enough to do this, to show that we have your back. I think the benefit, obviously, to the American side, and I think some of my panelists have highlighted this, is this absolutely strengthens America's posture and alliance network in the region. A more robust Australian approach and ability to deter Chinese coercion in the future is a net benefit to the American side. So I think this is, again, if everything works out as it should, the positive side. The complications are there, though. Number one, it's not that you snap your fingers and you have nuclear subs in the Indo-Pacific in 2 years. This is going to be a multi-year project. Multiple things can potentially go wrong. And in addition, this tethers the two so closely in security terms. We may say, and the governments may try to say, that this is a tactical agreement, but this is, not only is it big money, but it's also very strategically winding the countries in much more closely as allies. But as close as the US and Australia are, there are still issues where they don't agree. And one of these that I'll mention too is Australia's desire for a much more comprehensive US engagement in the Indo-Pacific. And today's discussion obviously is focused on security and defense, but the US lack of economic engagement in this region, in particular, their withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with which Australia is a member, again, is something that Australia hasn't forgotten. And I think that this region more broadly hasn't forgotten. So if there are hiccups that continue in the other parts of the relationship, I think that we need to think about how this might affect AUKUS going forward. My last point will be on the UK and sort of the opportunity I think this is presented for China. So for the UK, I think they are the sort of the third member in this, and in many ways they're feeling some of the collateral damage that perhaps they didn't anticipate or they should have anticipated. One of the big challenges I think the UK is going to find in this context is that, again, especially post-Brexit, this opens another cleavage, I think, for the Chinese side, if they wish to take it. And I would note that I think that the relationship between China and the EU, obviously with the frozen investment agreement and also some tensions between individual member states, are real, structural, and not going away easily. But I think this provides an opportunity for the Chinese to sort of play that wedge, which they've often liked to play, and essentially say to the European friends, look, this is the Americans basically going rogue with the Anglosphere. Maybe Japan's on board, but you should choose a different future. My sense is, and I think we have others on this panel that can comment on this, that the European side is very aware of the Chinese approach and tactics and is not easily dissuaded by this sort of line. But I think that the Chinese, if they could be humble, if they could swallow some of their some of the challenges that they've been facing recently in their relationship with Europe, obviously their sanctioning of EU officials, et cetera, they could seize an opportunity here because of this cleavage. So I'll leave it there, but looking forward to hearing from my panelists.
Thank you. Mathieu?
Yes, excellent points, Jonathan. Regarding the Australian submarine project and what the US can deliver, I just would like to add that after the period of 18 months negotiating the technical specificities of the project. We will know more details regarding the total cost. We will know more details regarding how the question of nuclear propulsion will be handled. And we will know more details, not more details, in fact, we know no details so far, but we will get some details regarding the level of technology transfers and the question of Australian jobs. These four issues are likely to be controversial and divisive in Australia. So we will see how it goes. What we have so far is a political agreement, not a technical agreement. Moving to the UK, I think the UK is engaged in a very impressive sequence of naval diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific with the dispatch of the aircraft carrier battle group that is currently conducting joint exercises with the Indian, American, Australian, and Japanese navies. It's very clear from the integrated review of the UK that, and I think I'm almost quoting the integrated review, that being the leading European power in terms of presence in the Indo-Pacific space is a guiding objective for the UK's engagement towards the region. This was clearly meant as an element of competition with France. I think it was black on white, and there was no surprise in that regard. And it explains so far, it explains to some extent the relatively muted French reactions vis-a-vis the UK. I think there are domestic politics elements demonstrating the reality of global Britain and seeking new spaces for deepening the footprint of the UK worldwide. So I think we have a clear direction and more action is to be accepted on the side of the UK, including towards India and Japan, and including in the area of defense cooperation. So to me, there is clarity on the part of the UK regarding where they are going. And there is this very interesting and easily misleading question regarding Europe, France, and strategic autonomy. And you hear a lot that France is making the mistake of speaking on behalf of the Europeans without consulting them in transatlantic exchanges. I think there's a number of elements to unpack here. I mean, clearly there is a French agenda to promote strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the US, but also inside Europe. Clearly, this is an agenda that is divisive, including within Europe. Not all countries are convinced. Some countries are against it very strongly. I was just in Poland 2 weeks ago. The sort of things you hear regarding the French strategic autonomy agenda is actually very, very strong. And vis-a-vis the United States, I think on the part of the French diplomacy to seek some sort of political endorsement for the notion of strategic autonomy has been misleading, I would say, because this is an almost abstract and theoretical strategic discussion regarding transatlantic relations without many concrete elements and to-do items on the list. But to be fair, I think that the French agenda of strategic autonomy is close to the German agenda of European sovereignty. This is about building elements of strengths for Europe. That's how I would define it. I think the definition would be contested by some, but in areas such as defense and arms industry, I think there is clarity there that we are working towards preserving a specific space in Europe. I think this also spans across issues such as data transfers, the question of internet and the digital space in Europe, but this also spans across issues such as the foreign direct investment space in Europe. I think that investment screening falls in the category of strategic autonomy. There is cooperation with the United States, but there are also limits to that cooperation. And this is something that was previously dealt as a national competence by member states, and that is being brought to the level of the European Union, even though the executive power remains with the member states. So there are a number of tools that are being built at the level of the EU that, to me, and that's the best concrete way I have to describe it, embody this idea of strategic autonomy. So a discussion that seems very abstract and theoretical and at the level of getting political endorsement is actually misleading in the sense that it contains very concrete elements of building a European toolbox of defensive measures not to be taken advantage of. That's how I would explain it.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. Alexandra, for closing remarks, we're getting close to the end, and especially on what to expect from the US-French discussions now.
Yeah, sure. On the question of the European reactions to the French reaction to the AUKUS alliance, I had many discussions with Swedish, Germans, Polish colleagues. There was a very prudent reaction to the French reaction, slightly embarrassed, looking at France and saying, "Oh, France is overreacting. Let's go back to business and let's, discuss with Americans and let's go back to, a normal relationship." That was pretty much felt across the different European capitals, and that is linked to, the strategic autonomy debate that Mathieu just raised, which I think that a problem probably that the French successive governments needs to realize is that when it raises the strategic autonomy argument in moments where we disagree or deeply disagree with our American partners, that continuously fuels the resistance of European partners that are obviously culturally skeptical vis-a-vis this notion of strategic autonomy, because that fuels again the perception that France is defending European strategic autonomy against the United States and de facto against NATO, which is not the case. And I think we need to get out of this very unproductive debate, both intra-European and with our American counterparts. It's really, to me, as Mathieu said, about looking at very concrete ways of actually implementing what I would rather call operational autonomy. And it's really about that. It's really about anticipating these scenarios where the United States will say, sorry, this is not a US vital interest, where NATO is not always the best operationalizing framework, and therefore Europeans will have to step up and take their own responsibilities, especially from a geographical standpoint in our eastern and southern neighborhood. So it's really about anticipating these scenarios, about thinking of what capabilities we need to develop together as Europeans. It can be either within the EU framework, it can be outside of the EU framework, like the European Intervention Initiative that President Macron launched back in 2018. It can be, like La Force Takuba in the Sahel, which brings together, quite impressive amount of European countries, special forces, as, a laboratory to train and to develop also, potentially a more common shared strategic culture. So this is really, I would say, the strategic autonomy, operational autonomy has been very much a bottom-up process, which is not a bad thing at all. But we need to look at these few examples that have been very concrete examples of how we could envisage moving forward, and not always putting it or articulating it vis-a-vis Washington, because that will alienate European partners that are traditionally, culturally already skeptical vis-a-vis that notion. Then very ending thought on France US relationship, and I mean, this is just the beginning. It's really about defining a common agenda, of defining a concrete way of working together. We need also to, of course, rebuild that trust. As I said, that is something that will take a certain amount of time, and I think that Washington needs to realize that France and Europeans can be an important player and partner, including in global vis-a-vis global challenges, right? It's not just about the European neighborhoods, but it's also about how to define a better way of cooperating on global challenges. So to me, I really hope that these different task force or working groups or strategic dialogues that have been launched these last few months, EU-US dialogue on China, on Russia, on trade, on tech. I think this is really the opportunity also for Europeans to put more of a substance in this dialogue, right? And not always be in a waiting mode. So how many times, Americans ask Europeans, okay, so what do you want? I mean, what is your strategy for the Indo-Pacific? What do you want to do? And Europeans often, have difficulties formulating how concretely they envision their own approach to address these more global challenges. So I think this is really an opportunity for Europeans, either EU or a coalition of European member states, to really be much more vocal and clearer in terms of their own strategic interests and how they want to project themselves, be it in the Indo-Pacific or in the Balkans, and make some concrete proposals. And I think that this would be very much welcome on the other side of the Atlantic. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, Jonathan, Matthew. I think we've reached the end of this conversation. There was really a lot to discuss, sometimes perhaps more questions than answers, but certainly a discussion we can continue in the future. As GMF Paris, we'll continue our partnership with the Canadian Embassy in Paris and with a future event on following the Summit for Democracy later this year. And I will invite all of you to continue to follow the work of my colleagues at the Asia program of the German Marshall Fund, very much focusing on transatlantic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. I wish you all a very good day, and till next time.